There are moments in time that fracture a community, that split the world into before and after. For the small town of Valdosta, Georgia, that moment came on October 12, 1991, when Rebecca Lynn Hartwell vanished on what should have been the happiest day of her life. She was 26 years old, a beloved elementary school teacher with a smile that could light up the darkest room, and she was wearing her wedding dress when she disappeared without a trace along a forgotten back road that cut through the edge of the Okefenokee wilderness. This is a story that haunted investigators for 32 years, a case that went cold when the evidence ran out and the leads dried up like the Georgia clay in summer heat. But it's also a story about persistence, about the relentless march of science, and about secrets that refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep they're hidden. Because in 2023, genetic genealogy finally revealed the truth behind Rebecca's disappearance, a truth that was somehow both simple and impossibly complicated, both human and something else entirely. The day Rebecca disappeared started like a fairy tale. October in South Georgia can be unpredictable, swinging between late summer heat and the first cool whispers of autumn. But that Saturday dawned clear and perfect. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock at First Baptist Church on Patterson Street, where Rebecca had taught vacation Bible school every summer since she'd moved to Valdosta 5 years earlier. Her fiancé, Daniel Moss, was a claims adjuster at the State Farm office downtown, steady, reliable, the kind of man parents hoped their daughters would marry. They'd met at a church potluck, courted for 18 months with old-fashioned propriety, and planned a modest wedding with close family and friends. Rebecca spent the morning at her apartment on Oak Street, a small one-bedroom place above the hardware store, where she could hear the church bells every Sunday. Her maid of honor, her college roommate Jennifer Caldwell, arrived at 9 with mimosas and pastries from the bakery on Ashley Street. They listened to Whitney Houston on the boombox, while Jennifer helped Rebecca pin her hair, the auburn curls catching the light that streamed through the lace curtains. The dress had been her mother's, carefully preserved and altered to fit Rebecca's smaller frame, ivory lace over satin, with pearl buttons running down the back. Her grandmother's locket, a delicate gold piece with a tiny photograph of Rebecca as a child inside, hung around her neck. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be. Jennifer would later tell police that Rebecca seemed nervous but happy, the normal jitters of any bride on her wedding day. They talked about the honeymoon, a modest trip to Savannah, 3 nights at a bed and breakfast near the river. They laughed about Daniel's terrible dancing at the rehearsal dinner, about how his best man had already started drinking at noon. At 2:30, Rebecca's mother arrived to help with final preparations. At 3 o'clock, Jennifer left to go get ready at the church, taking Rebecca's overnight bag with her. The plan was for Rebecca to drive herself to the church in her 1988 Honda Accord, arriving fashionably late at 3:45 for photographs before the ceremony. She never arrived. At 4:15, when Rebecca still hadn't shown up, Daniel called her apartment from the church office. No answer. He called again at 4:20. At 4:30, Jennifer drove back to Oak Street and found the apartment empty, the mimosa glasses still on the counter, Rebecca's everyday purse sitting on the kitchen table. Her car was gone. Jennifer felt the first flutter of real worry then, something instinctive and cold settling in her stomach. She drove the most direct route to the church, 3 miles down Patterson, left on Baytree, straight through downtown, but saw no sign of Rebecca's blue Honda. By 5 o'clock, Daniel had called the police. By 6, as the autumn sun began its descent toward the pine trees, casting long shadows across the empty church parking lot, Valdosta Police Department had issued a bolo for Rebecca and her vehicle. The guests dispersed in confused, worried clusters. Daniel's hands shook as he loosened his tie. Rebecca's mother sat in the church vestibule, clutching the bouquet of white roses that would never be carried down the aisle, tears streaming silently down her face. Detective Marcus Webb caught the case. He was 43 then, a 20-year veteran of the department with a reputation for thoroughness and a quiet, methodical approach to investigation. He'd worked missing persons cases before, runaways mostly. Teenagers fleeing bad situations usually found within 48 hours. But something about this one felt different from the start. A bride disappearing on her wedding day didn't fit any pattern he recognized. There was no history of cold feet, no secret boyfriend, no financial problems or family conflicts. Rebecca's life, by all accounts, was stable and happy. She had everything to live for, and no reason to run. The search began immediately. Officers canvassed the route between Rebecca's apartment and the church, then expanded outward in concentric circles. They checked hospitals, interviewed friends, contacted relatives in other states. Daniel submitted to a polygraph voluntarily. He passed. Rebecca's apartment was processed as a potential crime scene, but there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no forced entry. Everything suggested she'd left of her own accord, dressed in her wedding gown, car keys in hand. It was a deer hunter named Clayton Briggs who found Rebecca's car 3 days later, on Tuesday morning, October 15th. Clayton had been scouting for good spots along the back roads northeast of town, near where Lowndes County gives way to the swampy wilderness of the Okefenokee Basin. He'd turned onto an old clay road that wasn't much more than 2 tire tracks through the weeds, a forgotten access route that loggers had used decades earlier. About a quarter-mile in, where the pines pressed close and Spanish moss hung thick enough to block the sky, he saw the blue Honda pulled off to the side, driver's door hanging open. Clayton radioed it in from his truck, then waited by the main road until police arrived. Detective Webb got there within 30 minutes, his stomach tight with the knowledge that 3 days in the Georgia heat meant this case had probably just become a homicide investigation. But when he approached the vehicle, carefully, looking for any sign of Rebecca, what he found was somehow worse than a body. He found absence. He found questions without answers. The car was empty. Rebecca's keys were still in the ignition, turned to the off position. Her white satin purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet inside with $63 cash and all her credit cards untouched. The wedding dress train, which had pooled in the driver's seat, showed muddy footprints where someone had stepped on it. The driver's side door was open at full extension, the interior dome light long since burned out from draining the battery. There was no blood. No signs of violence inside the vehicle. But on the dusty clay beside the driver's door, Webb saw something that made his breath catch. A single white satin heel, the delicate shoe Rebecca had been wearing, lay partially pressed into the soft red earth. And beside it, leading away from the car toward the tree line, were drag marks. Long, deep furrows in the clay, as if something heavy had been pulled into the forest. But the marks were strange. Not the smooth tracks you'd expect from dragging a body, but irregular, interrupted with deep gouges on either side, like something with claws had been doing the pulling. Webb crouched down, careful not to disturb the scene, and studied the impressions. His training told him to think logically. An alligator, maybe, though they were rare this far from water. A black bear, though they typically avoided humans. But the spacing was wrong, the depth inconsistent. And there was something else, something he'd mention in his initial report, but would later wish he'd kept to himself. A smell, thick and organic, like wet animal fur mixed with something metallic and unfamiliar. It hung in the humid air around the car, strong enough that Clayton Briggs had commented on it too, describing it as wrong, just wrong, like nothing I've smelled in 30 years of hunting these woods. The crime scene unit from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation arrived by early afternoon. They photographed everything, cast impressions of the drag marks and the unusual prints they found leading into the forest, collected soil samples and fiber evidence. They found more pieces of Rebecca's dress snagged on branches and thorns as they followed the trail into the woods, scraps of ivory lace and torn satin, creating a grotesque breadcrumb path that led deeper into the forest. The trail went about 200 feet, weaving between longleaf pines and through palmetto thickets, and then it simply stopped. Just stopped. As if Rebecca had been carried into the air. The search expanded. Volunteers from 3 counties turned out, forming lines and walking grid patterns through the swampy terrain. They used dogs, bloodhounds that picked up Rebecca's scent from her apartment and tracked it to the car, then into the woods where it ended at the same inexplicable stopping point. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew overhead. Divers searched every pond, creek and sinkhole within a 5-mile radius. They found nothing. No body, no more physical evidence, Nothing but those scraps of dress, that single shoe, and those strange drag marks that led nowhere. The case made regional news, then national. Rebecca's smiling face appeared on television screens across the country, her engagement photo, where she wore a lavender sweater and that bright, optimistic smile. The story had everything the media loved: a beautiful bride, a mystery disappearance, a devoted fiancé. Theories proliferated. Some said she'd run away, though no one could explain why she'd drive to such an isolated location or leave without money. Some suggested foul play, pointing fingers at Daniel despite his alibi, and passed polygraph. Some whispered about serial killers. This was 1991, and the country was gripped by fears of predators lurking along highways and backroads. But in Valdosta, among the locals who knew these woods and this land, other theories circulated in hushed voices, stories that wouldn't make it into police reports or news broadcasts. Tales as old as the Okefenokee itself, passed down through generations of hunters and trappers and people who'd lived on the edge of the swamp long enough to know it had secrets. They talked about things seen in the twilight hours, shapes moving through the trees that were too large to be deer, too deliberate to be bears. They mentioned the old Creek Indian legends, the stories about creatures that walked like men but weren't men, about spirits that protected the deep swamp from intruders. Clayton Briggs, the hunter who'd found the car, told anyone who'd listen about a night 10 years earlier when he'd been camping near Black Creek and heard something moving through the forest. Footsteps too heavy to be human, too measured to be a four-legged animal. He'd stayed in his tent until dawn, his rifle loaded and his heart pounding, listening to something circle his campsite for hours. He'd found tracks the next morning, pressed deep into the mud near the creek bank that he couldn't identify. Large, almost human-shaped but with claw marks, spaced 6 feet apart, as if whatever made them had an impossibly long stride. Detective Webb documented everything, even the stories he didn't believe, because in a case with so few facts, you couldn't afford to dismiss anything. He interviewed Clayton extensively, visited the site of his encounter, looked at photographs of the tracks that had long since washed away. He talked to other locals who claimed to have seen or heard strange things in those woods. An elderly woman named Loretta Sims, who lived in a trailer near the swamp's edge, swore she'd heard screaming on the night Rebecca disappeared. Not human screaming, she insisted, but something that almost sounded human, echoing across the water and through the trees around midnight. She'd called the sheriff's office the next morning, but by then no one knew Rebecca was missing, and the report was filed away without follow-up. The physical evidence was sent to the state crime lab in Atlanta. The drag marks were analyzed, the plaster casts examined by wildlife experts. The official determination was inconclusive, possibly made by an alligator, though the size and pattern didn't quite match, possibly a bear, though black bears in Georgia rarely exceeded 300 pounds, and these marks suggested something significantly larger. The fiber evidence from Rebecca's dress showed tearing consistent with thorny vegetation. Soil analysis showed nothing unusual. The strange smell Webb and Briggs reported couldn't be captured or studied. Weeks became months. The massive search effort gradually scaled back as autumn turned to winter. The volunteers stopped coming. The news crews moved on to other stories. Daniel Moss left Valdosta, unable to bear the constant reminders and the whispered speculation. Rebecca's mother visited the spot where the car was found every Sunday after church, leaving flowers that wilted in the Georgia heat, praying for answers that never came. The case remained open, but inactive. One more file in a cabinet full of unsolved mysteries. Detective Webb never stopped thinking about it. Even after he retired in 2004, he kept copies of the case files in his home office, pulling them out periodically to review everything again, searching for the detail he'd missed, the connection he'd failed to make. He'd drive out to that old clay road sometimes, parking where Clayton Briggs had first spotted the Honda, walking into the woods to stand at the spot where the trail ended. He'd close his eyes and try to piece it together. What happened in those moments after Rebecca pulled over? Why she'd gotten out of the car in her wedding dress? What had dragged her into these trees and then simply vanished with her? The case went cold. Officially, thoroughly cold. The kind of cold that settles into bones and doesn't let go. But cases, like bodies, sometimes resurface when you least expect them. And in March 2023, 32 years after Rebecca Hartwell disappeared on her wedding day, a dog walker in the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge made a discovery that would finally begin to answer the questions that had haunted Valdosta for more than 3 decades. What they found was partial, weathered, scattered by time and animals and the slow decay of the swamp itself. What they found were human remains. And tangled with those remains, something that didn't make sense, something that would require science and stubbornness and a new generation of investigators to unravel. Because the truth about what happened to Rebecca wasn't as simple as murder, and it wasn't as impossible as the old legends suggested. It was somehow both and neither, and it would take genetic genealogy, a technology that didn't exist in 1991, to reveal the man who'd been there that day, the man whose DNA was found on Rebecca's remains, the man who'd taken her into those woods. But even when they found him, even when they had his name and his confession, there would still be questions. Because some mysteries have answers that create new mysteries. Some truths only deepen the darkness. Was Rebecca's disappearance purely the work of human evil, or was there something else in those woods that October day, something that can't be explained by forensics or confessions or rational thought? The Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge spans nearly 500,000 acres across southern Georgia and northern Florida. A vast wilderness of blackwater swamps, cypress forests and prairies that seem to exist outside of time. The Seminole people called it Land of the Trembling Earth because the peat deposits are so thick and spongy that trees and ground shake when you walk on them. It's a place where nature still holds dominion, where alligators sun themselves on logs and black bears forage through palmetto thickets, where the water runs dark as tea from tannic acid and reflects the sky like obsidian glass. It's also a place where things can stay hidden for decades. On March 17, 2023, a woman named Patricia Hendricks was walking her German Shepherd along one of the marked trails on the refuge's eastern boundary, about 8 miles from where Rebecca Hartwell's car had been found in 1991. It was mid-morning, the air already warming toward the 80s, humid and thick with the smell of wet earth and vegetation. Her dog, Zeus, pulled away from the trail, nose to the ground, drawn by some scent Patricia couldn't detect. She followed him about 50 yards into the brush, calling for him to come back, when Zeus stopped at the base of a massive cypress tree and began digging frantically at the ground. Patricia pulled him back, and that's when she saw it. Something pale protruding from the dark soil and leaf litter, something that looked disturbingly like bone. She knew immediately what she was looking at, felt the cold recognition in her gut even before her mind fully processed it. She pulled Zeus away, tied him to a tree back on the trail and called 911 with shaking hands. The Charlton County Sheriff's Department responded first, followed by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The site was secured, photographed, and carefully excavated over the following week. What they found was a partial skeleton, significantly degraded by 32 years of exposure to the elements, scattered by animals, partially buried by the slow accumulation of organic material that characterizes the swamp's ecosystem. But there was enough bone to establish that these were human remains, enough dental work to make a preliminary identification, and enough intact DNA to change everything. The dental records matched Rebecca Lynn Hartwell. After 32 years, she'd finally been found, but the condition and location of the remains raised immediate questions. 8 miles from where her car was discovered, deep in terrain that would have been nearly impossible to navigate in a wedding dress, in an area that had been searched, though admittedly not as thoroughly as the immediate vicinity of the vehicle. How had her body ended up here? Who had brought her? And perhaps most disturbing to the investigators who processed the scene, why did some of the bones show unusual damage? Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist from the GBI, conducted the skeletal analysis. She'd worked dozens of cases involving bodies recovered from wilderness areas, understood the predictable patterns of decomposition and scattering by scavengers. But Rebecca's remains showed patterns that troubled her. Several ribs had fractures consistent with severe trauma, not from animals, but from crushing force applied when the victim was still alive. The left femur showed deep scoring marks that could have been made by animal teeth, but the spacing and depth were unusual, not quite matching any species documented in the region. And most puzzling, some of the smaller bones, fingers, toes, were missing entirely, in a pattern that didn't fit typical scavenger behavior. "It's like something carried her, Doctor," Chen told the lead investigator, Special Agent Marcus Riley from the GBI. "The trauma pattern suggests she was gripped around the torso with tremendous force. The distribution of the remains suggests the body was moved after death, brought here from somewhere else. But I can't tell you what moved her because the evidence doesn't match anything in my reference database." The real breakthrough came from the DNA analysis. Along with Rebecca's genetic material, the lab found foreign DNA on several of the bones, specifically on the ribs that showed crushing trauma. It was degraded, partial, but enough to establish a profile. Male, Caucasian. Not Daniel Moss, whose DNA was already on file from the original investigation and had been definitively excluded. This was someone else, someone whose genetic material had been transferred to Rebecca's body in the moments of her death or shortly thereafter. This is where the science gets fascinating, where a technology that didn't exist in 1991 finally broke open a case that had been cold for 3 decades. The GBI submitted the DNA profile to a genetic genealogy company called Parabon Nanolabs, specialists in using DNA evidence to identify suspects through their family trees. The process is painstaking. They take the DNA profile and compare it against millions of entries in public genealogy databases, looking for relatives who voluntarily submitted their genetic information to trace their ancestry. What they're looking for are matches, second cousins, third cousins, distant relatives who share enough genetic markers to indicate a common ancestor. Then genealogists work backward and forward through census records, birth certificates, death records, building family trees until they narrow down to potential suspects. It's the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer in 2018. That solved the murder of April Tinsley. That's brought closure to dozens of families desperate for answers about their missing loved ones. In Rebecca's case, the genealogist assigned to build the family tree was a woman named Linda Mercer, a 62-year-old former librarian who'd found a second career using her research skills to solve cold cases. She worked from her home office in Olympia, Washington, spending hours each day staring at computer screens filled with family trees that branched and connected like organic networks, looking for the patterns that would reveal a name. She found it in 6 weeks. The DNA matched several third and fourth cousins in the database, all connected to a family with roots in South Georgia, going back generations. Linda traced the lines forward, eliminating individuals based on age, location, and gender, narrowing the possibilities until only one name remained that fit all the parameters. A man who would have been 34 years old in 1991, who lived within 20 miles of where Rebecca disappeared, who had no alibi for that October day because no one had ever thought to ask him for one. His name was Vernon Dale Kimball. On May 3, 2023, Special Agent Riley sat in an interview room at the GBI regional office in Valdosta, a folder thick with evidence on the table in front of him, waiting for Vernon Kimball to arrive with his court-appointed attorney. Riley had spent the past 2 weeks learning everything about this man, building a profile, looking for the patterns that would help him understand how and why an elementary school teacher in her wedding dress had crossed paths with a man who, by all accounts, lived on society's margins. Vernon Kimball was 66 years old now, weathered and worn by hard living and harder choices. In 1991, he'd been a drifter, working odd jobs, logging, hunting guides, seasonal work at the farms that dotted rural Lowndes County. He'd grown up in nearby Clinch County, dropped out of school at 16, had a string of minor arrests for poaching, trespassing, assault. He'd lived in a trailer on his uncle's property about 15 miles from where Rebecca's car was found, right on the edge of the wilderness that bled into the Okefenokee Basin. He knew those woods. Knew them better than almost anyone. And in October 1991, he'd been out there, hunting illegally on private land, when Rebecca Hartwell had pulled her blue Honda onto that clay road for reasons that Riley still didn't fully understand. When Vernon walked into the interview room, shuffling in the orange jumpsuit they'd put him in when they arrested him 3 days earlier, Riley saw an old man, diminished by time, liver-spotted hands cuffed in front of him, eyes that had once been sharp, now clouded with cataracts and fear. They sat across from each other in silence for a long moment, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, before Riley opened the folder and slid the first photograph across the table. It was Rebecca's engagement photo, the one with the lavender sweater and the bright smile. "Do you remember her, Vernon?" Vernon stared at the photo, his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter, and finally nodded. "I remember." Over the next 4 hours, in a confession that was recorded and witnessed and would later be used to close a case that had haunted a community for 32 years, Vernon Dale Kimball told them what happened on October 12, 1991. He told them about being out in the woods that afternoon, checking his illegal trap lines, a rifle slung over his shoulder because he never went into those woods unarmed. He told them about hearing a car engine on the old clay road, unusual because nobody used that access route anymore, and creeping through the trees to see who it was. He saw the blue Honda, saw a woman in a white dress get out of the car, looking confused, looking at something on the ground. She'd gotten a flat tire, he realized, the front passenger side, the tire shredded by something sharp she'd driven over. She was just standing there in her wedding dress, miles from anywhere. No cell phone because this was 1991 and cell phones weren't common, especially not in rural Georgia, looking at that flat tire like it was a problem she couldn't solve. Vernon said he watched her for a while, debating whether to approach or stay hidden. He knew he looked rough, knew he smelled like the woods and sweat, knew that a woman alone wouldn't welcome the approach of a man like him. But then he thought about the reward, about maybe getting some money from her for helping, about how grateful she'd be. So he stepped out of the tree line, rifle in hand, and called out to her. Rebecca turned, saw him, and Vernon said he could see the fear flash across her face immediately. She tried to smile, tried to be polite, told him she was fine, that she'd called for help already. A lie, obviously, since there was no way to call from there. But Vernon kept approaching, kept saying he could help, change the tire, get her back on the road. He said he didn't mean to scare her, said he just wanted to help. But Rebecca backed away toward the car, one hand reaching for the door handle. And that's when Vernon said something changed in him, something ugly he'd carried his whole life that suddenly bloomed into action. He grabbed her arm, told her not to be stupid, told her he was trying to help. She screamed, pulled away, lost her shoe in the struggle. And Vernon, scared now that she'd report him, that he'd go back to jail for assault or worse, did what fear makes men do. He hurt her. He told the investigators he hit her with the rifle stock, trying to quiet her screaming. Hit her hard enough to crack ribs, hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. She fell into the clay beside the car, gasping, eyes wide with terror and pain. Vernon panicked. He could see she was badly hurt, could see this had gone far beyond what he'd intended, and in that moment of panic, he did the only thing that made sense to his frightened, desperate mind. He dragged her into the woods, pulled her by the arms across the clay, her dress tearing on roots and rocks, into the tree line where the shadows were thick and no one would see. She was alive, he insisted, still breathing when he got her about 200 feet into the forest. He left her there, covered her with branches and leaves, told himself she might survive, that someone might find her. Then he ran, back to his trailer, stayed inside for 3 days, drinking himself numb, waiting for the police to come. They never did. The search went right past where he'd left her, the volunteers and dogs somehow missing her location in the vast complexity of the swamp forest. And after a few days, Vernon said, he went back to check. He found her gone. Not dead where he'd left her, but gone, the branches disturbed, drag marks leading deeper into the swamp, and tracks. The same kind of tracks he'd seen before in these woods, the ones he'd learned not to talk about because people called you crazy when you did. This is where Vernon's confession got strange. This is where the rational narrative of a crime, assault, murder, disposal of a body, fractured into something else. Because Vernon insisted, with tears streaming down his weathered face, that he didn't kill Rebecca Hartwell. He hurt her, yes, left her injured and dying in the woods, yes, but something else took her. Something else dragged her 8 miles deeper into the swamp and finished what he'd started. I heard it that night, Vernon said, his voice barely above a whisper. After I left her, I was back at my trailer maybe 3 hours later, and I heard something in the woods, something big, moving fast, and then screaming, not human screaming, but close enough that it made my blood freeze. I knew those woods, spent my whole life in them, and I never heard nothing like that before or since. Special Agent Riley listened to all of this, recorded every word, and then asked the question that needed asking, "Are you telling me an animal dragged her away?" Vernon looked up, met Riley's eyes, and said, "I don't know what it was. I just know it wasn't no animal I ever seen. The tracks, they was almost like a man's, but too big, too deep, claws instead of toes. And the way it moved through that swamp, carrying her weight plus its own, moving through terrain that would slow down a truck. No, sir, I don't know what that was." The confession was detailed enough, corroborated by enough evidence, that the district attorney charged Vernon Dale Kimball with felony murder, aggravated assault, and concealing a death. His DNA matched what was found on Rebecca's remains. His account of the initial attack matched the trauma patterns Dr. Chen had documented. The location where he said he'd left her was roughly 2 miles from where the remains were eventually found, close enough, given the degradation of memory over 3 decades, to be credible. But the question remained, how did Rebecca's body get from where Vernon left her to where it was finally discovered? Vernon's story about something else in the woods, something that took her, was dismissed by the prosecution as a self-serving attempt to minimize his culpability. After all, murderers have been blaming mysterious forces for their crimes since the beginning of time. It was easier to accept that Vernon, in his panic and drunkenness, had moved the body himself and simply didn't remember, or chose not to remember, than to entertain the alternative. And yet, Detective Marcus Webb, now 75 years old and officially retired but still deeply invested in this case, wasn't so sure. When Agent Riley called him to share the news of the arrest and confession, Webb felt relief and satisfaction, and the weight of 32 years finally lifting. But he also felt something else. Doubt. The same doubt he'd felt standing by that Honda in 1991, smelling that wrong smell, looking at those inexplicable drag marks. Webb drove out to the Okefenokee, got a permit to visit the site where Patricia Hendricks's dog had found the remains. He stood there in the humid heat, surrounded by cypress trees and the constant buzz of insects, and tried to imagine Vernon Kimball carrying or dragging an injured woman 8 miles through this terrain. At night. In 1991, Vernon would have been strong, capable, familiar with the landscape. But 8 miles through swamp forest carrying dead weight, leaving minimal trace. It seemed unlikely. Not impossible, but unlikely. Webb talked to Dr. Chen, asked her again about the bone damage, the scoring marks that didn't quite match any documented species. She showed him the photographs, pointed out the depth and spacing. "If I had to guess," she said carefully, "I'd say something with significant jaw strength and claws longer than any black bear I've studied. But that doesn't mean it's anything paranormal or unknown. It could be an unusually large bear or damage from multiple animals over many years. Decomposition and scavenging can create patterns that look strange, but have completely natural explanations. Could be, might be, possibly, the language of science confronting evidence that doesn't quite fit the expected patterns." Webb also tracked down Clayton Briggs, the hunter who'd found Rebecca's car. Clayton was in his 70s now, still living near the swamp, still hunting those woods despite his age. They sat on Clayton's back porch, drinking sweet tea in the afternoon shade, and talked about what Clayton had seen and heard over 5 decades of ranging through the Okefenokee wilderness. "I ain't saying I know what's out there," Clayton said slowly, choosing his words with care. "But I know what I've seen. Tracks that don't match no animal in the books. Trees with claw marks 10, 12 feet up the trunk. Sounds at night that make you want to pack up and leave even when you've been camping the same spot for 20 years. Most folks, they'll tell you it's just bears or your imagination or maybe a panther, even though panther's been extinct in Georgia since the 30s. But some of us, we know there's things in the deep swamp that don't got names. Things that were here before people and will be here after." Webb didn't dismiss it. Couldn't dismiss it. Because he'd learned over his long career that the world was stranger and more complex than any official report could capture. that there was space between what science could explain and what people experienced, and in that space lived possibilities that made rational men uncomfortable. The case against Vernon Kimball moved forward. He pleaded guilty in October 2023, exactly 32 years and 1 month after Rebecca disappeared, accepting a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, Rebecca's mother, now in her 80s, frail but fierce, read a victim impact statement that brought the entire courtroom to tears. She talked about 3 decades of not knowing, of that special torture reserved for families of the missing. She talked about her daughter's kindness, her potential, all the children she would have taught and the life she would have lived. And she thanked the investigators, the genealogists, the scientists who'd finally given her family closure. But she also said something else, something that made its way into the local news coverage. "I know Vernon Kimball hurt my daughter. I know he's responsible for taking her from us. But I also believe something else was in those woods that day, something that our court system can't address and our justice system can't punish. I hope God holds accountable whatever else had a hand in my baby's death, because we humans can only do so much." The case was officially closed, the file marked solved. Rebecca Lynn Hartwell's name moved from the missing persons database to the resolved cold case list. The community of Valdosta held a memorial service, finally able to mourn properly. And Rebecca was buried in the church cemetery where she'd once taught Bible school, her grave marker reading, "Beloved daughter, teacher and friend, gone too soon but never forgotten." And still the questions lingered. In the bars and diners of Valdosta, in the churches and coffee shops, people talked about what Vernon Kimball had said, about something else in the woods. About those tracks and that smell and the sounds that Clayton Briggs and others had reported over the years. About whether the official resolution of the case was the complete story or just the version that fit within the boundaries of what we're willing to accept as real. Because the truth is, some evidence doesn't fit neatly into reports. Some witness statements describe things that can't be reconciled with known species or rational explanations. And some crimes, even when solved, leave behind shadows that won't disperse no matter how much light you shine. Was there something else in the Okefenokee that October night in 1991? Something that heard Rebecca's cries, that found her broken and dying where Vernon had left her, that carried her 8 miles deeper into the swamp for reasons we can't begin to understand? Or is that just how we cope with evil, by imagining forces beyond the human, making myths out of the darkness so we don't have to face the simple, terrible truth that sometimes bad men do bad things and the wilderness is just wilderness? In the months following Vernon Kimball's conviction, something unexpected happened in Valdosta and the surrounding counties. People started talking, not just about Rebecca Hartwell's case, but about other experiences, other encounters, other moments in the Okefenokee wilderness that they'd kept quiet about for years, sometimes decades, because they feared ridicule or dismissal. It was as if Vernon's confession, specifically his claim about something else in the woods, had opened a door that people had been afraid to walk through. Special Agent Marcus Riley found himself fielding calls and emails from individuals who'd read about the case, who felt compelled to share their own stories. He documented them all, even though the case was officially closed, because that's what good investigators do. They follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads into uncomfortable territory. There was Thomas Reinhardt, a wildlife biologist who'd worked for the Georgia Department of Natural Resources in the 1990s, conducting surveys in the Okefenokee. In July 1992, 9 months after Rebecca disappeared, Thomas had been out on the swamp in a small boat, taking water samples and documenting bird populations. He'd pulled up to a small island, really just a raised mound of earth and vegetation, to eat lunch when he noticed something strange. Large tracks in the mud along the waterline, pressed deep into the soft earth, fresh enough that water was still seeping into the impressions. Thomas had photographed them, following protocol. The tracks were roughly humanoid in shape, but significantly larger than any human foot, with what appeared to be claw marks at the toe positions. The stride length, measured between prints, was over 6 feet. In his official report, Thomas had noted them as unidentified, possibly bear, But privately, he'd told his supervisor something else, that these tracks didn't match any animal he'd been trained to identify, that the pressure depth suggested something weighing between 400 and 500 pounds, and that the distribution pattern indicated bipedal locomotion. His supervisor had advised him to amend his report to be less specific, to avoid starting rumors or drawing the wrong kind of attention to the refuge. So Thomas had complied, filed away his photographs, and tried not to think about the fact that when he'd returned to his boat and started the motor, he'd heard something moving through the trees on that island, something large enough to shake the trunks of the cypress trees as it moved. Something that followed along the shore for nearly a quarter mile before the sound finally faded. Riley obtained copies of those photographs from Thomas, now retired and living in Athens. He brought them to Dr. Chen, asked her to compare them with the casts taken from the scene of Rebecca's car in 1991. She studied them for a long time, measuring proportions, analyzing the pressure patterns, and finally looked up at Riley with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Uncertainty mixed with something that might have been fear. "They're consistent," she said quietly. "Not identical, because we're comparing a cast with a photograph, and they're from different substrates, clay versus mud. But the size, the shape, the claw positioning, they're remarkably similar. If I didn't know better, I'd say they were made by the same thing." "But you do know better," Riley prompted. "I know what's supposed to be possible," Dr. Chen corrected. "That's not the same as knowing what is possible." There were other accounts. Jennifer Caldwell, Rebecca's maid of honor, who'd waited at the church that terrible October day, contacted Riley with something she'd never mentioned to police in 1991. In the weeks before the wedding, Rebecca had been taking evening walks along the trails at Reed Bingham State Park, about 20 miles from Valdosta, trying to work off nervous energy and pre-wedding stress. One evening in late September, Rebecca had come back from a walk visibly shaken, telling Jennifer about seeing something at the edge of the park boundary where the maintained trails gave way to wilderness. She said it was standing in the trees, just standing there watching her, Jennifer told Riley over the phone, her voice still carrying the weight of 32 years of guilt for not taking her friend's fear seriously. She described it as tall, really tall, covered in dark hair or fur but standing upright like a person. She said it wasn't a bear because of how it stood, how it watched her. I laughed it off, told her she was just stressed and seeing things in the shadows. But she was genuinely frightened, Marcus. She cut her walk short and didn't want to go back to that park. Riley felt a chill run down his spine. Did she report it to park rangers or police? No. I convinced her not to, told her people would think she was crazy. God help me, I thought I was being a good friend, saving her from embarrassment. Jennifer's voice broke. What if that thing, whatever she saw, what if it followed her? What if that's why she ended up on that road? It was a question Riley couldn't answer, but it added another layer to the mystery. Because here's what he'd discovered in reviewing the case file. There was no good reason for Rebecca to have been on that particular clay road. It wasn't on any route between her apartment and the church. It wasn't a shortcut to anywhere. It was, in fact, a significant detour, miles out of her way, down a road that most locals didn't even know existed. The original investigators had theorized she'd gotten lost, made a wrong turn in her nervousness. But Rebecca had lived in Valdosta for 5 years, knew the roads, and had driven to that church dozens of times. Getting lost didn't fit. Neither did the flat tire explanation, because the tire damage was examined in 1991 and found to be consistent with running over something sharp. But there was nothing sharp on that clay road, nothing that would explain the specific type of puncture damage to the tire, unless she'd been trying to evade something, unless she'd turned onto that road deliberately, seeking escape or distance from something that frightened her. Unless the flat tire wasn't accidental, but the result of desperate high-speed driving over rough terrain. Riley interviewed Daniel Moss, Rebecca's fiancé, who was now 60 years old and remarried, living in Macon. Daniel had never fully recovered from Rebecca's disappearance, carried the weight of unanswered questions for 3 decades before Vernon's arrest finally gave him some measure of peace. But when Riley asked if Rebecca had mentioned seeing anything unusual in the weeks before the wedding, Daniel's face changed. "She had nightmares," Daniel said slowly, as if the memory was surfacing for the first time in years. The last week before the wedding, she woke up 3 times that I know of from bad dreams. She said she kept dreaming about being chased through the woods by something she couldn't see clearly, something that wanted her. I thought it was just wedding anxiety, you know, cold feet expressing itself symbolically. But now I wonder if she sensed something, if somehow she knew danger was coming. Human intuition is a strange thing, poorly understood by science, but respected by experienced investigators. Riley had learned over his career that people sometimes know things before they consciously understand them, that the subconscious mind picks up on subtle cues and patterns that the rational mind dismisses. Had Rebecca sensed she was being watched, being stalked? Had Vernon Kimball been following her before that day, learning her routines, waiting for an opportunity? Or had it been something else tracking her, something drawn to her for reasons we couldn't comprehend? The genetic genealogy that had cracked the case also revealed some disturbing information about Vernon Kimball's background. Linda Mercer, the genealogist who'd built the family tree, continued her research after the arrest, driven by professional curiosity and a sense that there was more to understand about this man. What she found was a family history steeped in the Okefenokee, generations of Kimballs living on the swamp's edge, making their living from its resources. Logging, hunting, fishing, guiding tourists in the early days of the refuge. But there were also stories passed down through the family that Linda found in old letters and journals she accessed through historical societies and family members willing to talk. Stories about Vernon's great-grandfather, Elijah Kimball, who'd supposedly made a deal with something in the swamp back in the 1920s, trading his daughter to a creature in exchange for protection of his hunting grounds. The daughter, Sarah Kimball, had disappeared at age 16 in 1923, never found despite extensive searches. The family had whispered that Elijah had led her into the deep swamp and left her there, a sacrifice to whatever dwelt in those ancient waters. Then there was Vernon's own father, Dale Kimball, who disappeared in 1978 when Vernon was 21. Dale had gone into the swamp hunting and never come back. His body was never recovered. Vernon had told authorities at the time that his father had probably fallen into a sinkhole or been taken by an alligator, accidents that happened in the Okefenokee with grim regularity. But neighbors whispered that Dale had been ranting in the weeks before he disappeared about something following him, about owing a debt that needed to be paid. Was it just family tragedy and coincidence, the kind of dark history that many families carry? Or was there something more, some pattern of the Kimball men encountering something in those woods, something that demanded a price? Riley didn't believe in curses or supernatural debts, but he couldn't ignore the pattern. 3 generations of Kimball men, all connected to disappearances in or around the Okefenokee. And now Vernon, whose own encounter with Rebecca had been witnessed, according to his confession, by something else in those woods. The physical evidence continued to trouble Dr. Chen. She'd sent samples of the scoring marks on Rebecca's bones to a colleague at the Smithsonian who specialized in prehistoric predators and their feeding patterns. The colleague, Dr. Alan Matsuda, called her back with results that were simultaneously interesting and frustrating. "The marks are consistent with a large predator," Dr. Matsuda told her. "But the depth and spacing don't match any extant North American species. They're similar to what you might see from a large primate, gorilla, for instance, but gorillas haven't existed in North America for millions of years, and even then, we're talking about species that went extinct in the Miocene epoch. The closest living analog would be, well, there isn't one, not in this hemisphere." "Could it be post-mortem damage from multiple animals over many years?" Dr. Chen asked, hoping for the rational explanation. "Possibly, probably even. Decomposition and scavenging can create complex damage patterns, but—" Dr. Matsuda paused. "If I'm being honest, and this is completely off the record, the marks look purposeful. They look like predation, not scavenging, and the force required to create scoring this deep in bone, this dense. We're talking about something with jaw strength significantly exceeding a black bear or even a large alligator. Off the record, the phrase investigators use when the evidence leads somewhere that can't fit into official reports." Riley made one more trip to the Okefenokee, this time with Clayton Briggs as his guide. They went deep into the refuge, to areas that tourists never see, following old trails and waterways that Clayton had navigated for 50 years. They were looking for something specific. More tracks, more physical evidence, anything that might corroborate or refute the stories that had been accumulating. They didn't find tracks. What they found, about 12 miles into the swamp, was a clearing that shouldn't exist. The Okefenokee is dense, choked with vegetation, every square foot fought over by competing plants and trees. But this clearing, roughly 50 feet in diameter, was different. The trees around its perimeter showed damage, deep claw marks in the bark, extending up to 12 feet high on some of the larger cypresses. The ground inside the clearing was packed hard, as if something heavy had moved over it repeatedly, compressing the usually spongy peat into something almost solid. And in the center of the clearing, they found bones, not human bones, but animal remains, deer, wild boar, even what appeared to be a young black bear. The bones were scattered but concentrated, picked clean, some showing the same type of scoring marks that Rebecca's remains had exhibited. It looked like a feeding site, a place where something brought its kills to consume them. Clayton stood at the edge of the clearing, his weathered face unreadable. "I've been coming out here for near about 50 years, he said quietly, "and I ain't never seen this clearing before. It's like it appeared out of nowhere, or maybe I just never went this exact route before. But I'll tell you what, I don't like it. I don't like the feel of it, and I ain't staying here past sunset." They documented everything, took photographs and GPS coordinates, collected some of the bones for analysis. Riley felt it too, what Clayton was describing, a wrongness to the place, a sense of being watched, of trespassing in territory that didn't welcome human presence. The forest around them was unnaturally quiet, no bird calls or insect sounds, as if the wildlife knew to avoid this area. As they were preparing to leave, Clayton pointed up into one of the trees. "You see that?" Riley looked up and felt his stomach tighten. About 30 feet up, a massive cypress, wedged into a fork in the branches, was a piece of fabric, faded by years of weather, torn and barely recognizable, but still identifiable by its color and texture. Ivory lace. The same type of lace from Rebecca Hartwell's wedding dress. They couldn't reach it, couldn't retrieve it without climbing equipment they didn't have. But Riley photographed it extensively, documented its location. The site where Rebecca's remains had been found was over 8 miles from this clearing. How had a piece of her dress ended up here, 30 feet above the ground? Had birds carried it? Had the wind blown it impossibly through dense forest? Or had something else brought it here, to this feeding ground, this territory that felt like it belonged to something we didn't have a name for? Back in Valdosta, Riley compiled everything into a supplemental report. He included the witness statements, the photographs from the clearing, Dr. Matsuda's analysis, the family history Linda Mercer had uncovered. He noted the inconsistencies and unanswered questions, the evidence that didn't quite fit the neat narrative of Vernon Kimball as the sole perpetrator. He acknowledged that Vernon's confession covered the initial assault and his responsibility for Rebecca's death, but suggested that the disposition of her body and some of the physical evidence indicated possible involvement of an unknown large predator. His supervisor read the report, looked at the photographs, and then looked at Riley with the expression of someone trying to decide how much truth they wanted to acknowledge. "This is good work, Marcus. Thorough. But you understand why we can't include most of this in the official case file? We've got a confession, a conviction, a closed case. The family has closure. The community has answers. Starting to speculate about unknown predators or mysterious creatures. It undermines the resolution we've achieved and opens us up to criticism." "I understand, sir, but the evidence proves Vernon Kimball killed Rebecca Hartwell. Everything else is speculation. Could there be an undocumented large predator in the Okefenokee? Maybe. Probably not, but maybe. Does it change Vernon's guilt or the fact that justice has been served? No. So we include what's relevant to the prosecution, and we file the rest as supplemental information for future researchers who might be interested in the wildlife angle. It was the compromise that institutions make when confronted with evidence that doesn't fit established paradigms. Not quite a cover-up, but not full disclosure either. The official record would show a murder solved through genetic genealogy, a cold case triumph of modern forensic science. The unofficial record, the supplemental files that might be declassified in 50 years, would contain the strange and troubling details that suggested the story was more complex than the official version admitted. Riley accepted it because he understood the necessity of institutional stability, of giving communities the closure they needed. But he also kept copies of everything in his personal files, because he'd learned that today's impossible speculation sometimes became tomorrow's accepted fact. The scientific community that studied cryptozoology and unknown species had their own reactions to the case. When details began to leak out, as they always do, despite best efforts at containment, researchers who'd spent decades investigating reports of large bipedal creatures in North American forests saw the Rebecca Hartwell case as potential validation of their work. But they also understood that without a body, without clear photographs or video, without incontrovertible physical evidence, the mainstream scientific establishment would never accept that something unknown lived in the Okefenokee. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, who'd spent years studying alleged Bigfoot evidence, reviewed the photographs of the tracks and the bone scoring marks at Riley's request. His assessment was cautious, but intriguing. The evidence is consistent with what we've seen in other alleged cryptid encounters across North America. Large bipedal tracks, evidence of significant strength, behaviors that suggest intelligence and territoriality. But consistency isn't proof. It's suggestive, it's interesting. But until we have DNA evidence from the alleged creature itself, or clear photographic evidence, it remains in the realm of the unexplained rather than the proven. DNA evidence from the creature itself. That was the key, and it's what Riley kept hoping they'd find in the samples from Rebecca's remains. But the foreign DNA on her bones had been matched to Vernon Kimball. There was no third source, no unknown genetic profile that would prove something else had been involved, which meant either Vernon was the only one who'd touched her, or whatever else had been there hadn't left identifiable genetic material, either because it was careful or because it had been so many years that any trace had degraded beyond recovery. The community of Valdosta, for their part, remained divided. Most were satisfied with the official resolution, grateful for the closure, ready to remember Rebecca and move on from the mystery that had haunted them for 3 decades. But others, particularly those who'd lived near the Okefenokee for generations, who'd heard the old stories and maybe experienced their own unsettling encounters, believed there was more to the story. They talked in small groups, shared their theories in whispers, and remained vigilant when they ventured into the swamp's edge. Rebecca's mother, Martha Hartwell, passed away in December 2023, 3 months after Vernon's sentencing. She was 84 and had lived long enough to see her daughter's killer face justice. At her funeral, the pastor noted that Martha had finally found peace, that she could rest knowing the truth. But Jennifer Caldwell, who spoke at the service, added something the pastor hadn't mentioned. Martha told me about a week before she died that she'd made peace with not knowing everything. She said Vernon Kimball was responsible for attacking her daughter, and for that he'd been punished. But she also said she hoped that if there was something else in those woods that night, something that ended Becca's suffering or accompanied her in those final hours, she hoped it was something merciful. She hoped her daughter hadn't died alone and afraid, but maybe in the presence of something ancient and mysterious, something that was part of the natural order we don't fully understand. It was a mother's wish, a way of finding meaning in senseless tragedy. But it also reflected a truth that Riley had come to understand through his investigation, that sometimes the line between predator and witness, between evil and nature, between what we know and what we can't explain, is blurrier than we want to admit. The case was closed. Vernon Kimball would die in prison. Rebecca Hartwell was finally laid to rest. The official record was complete. But the questions remained, hanging over the Okefenokee like the Spanish moss that drapes its cypress trees, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What really happened in those woods on October 12, 1991? Was it simply a tragic encounter between a vulnerable woman and a violent man, the kind of horror that happens all too often in isolated places? Or was there something more, something that witnessed or participated in that tragedy? Something that still moves through those ancient swamps, leaving tracks and marks and mysteries in its wake. In the 2 years following Vernon Kimball's conviction, the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge experienced something unusual. Reports of strange encounters increased dramatically, not from tourists or casual visitors, but from experienced rangers, wildlife biologists, and locals who'd spent lifetimes in those swamps and knew the difference between ordinary wildlife and something else. Park Ranger Diana Torres had worked the Okefenokee for 12 years, since 2011, and prided herself on her knowledge of the ecosystem. She could identify bird calls in the dark, track animals by the subtlest signs, navigate the waterways blindfolded if necessary, but in March 2025, she experienced something that shook her confidence in what she thought she knew about the refuge. She'd been conducting a solo survey of the eastern boundary, the same general area where Rebecca's remains had been found. It was late afternoon, that golden hour before dusk, when the light turns honey-colored and the shadows grow long. Diana was following a game trail documenting deer populations when she realized the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of her own breathing and heartbeat. She'd experienced this before. It's what happens when a predator moves through an area, when prey animals freeze and wait for danger to pass. She stopped, hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on her belt, scanning the trees for whatever had triggered this response. And that's when she saw it. About 60 yards ahead, partially obscured by a stand of cypress trees, something was standing upright. Not a bear on its hind legs. She'd seen that plenty of times. This was different. Taller, at least 7 feet, with a bulk that suggested immense strength. It was covered in dark hair or fur, and it was looking directly at her. Diana froze. Every instinct told her not to move, not to run, to make herself as non-threatening as possible. They stood that way for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 30 seconds. Woman and something, watching each other across the distance. Then, without any sound that Diana could hear, it turned and moved into the forest. Not crashing through the undergrowth like a bear would, but moving with a fluid, deliberate grace that seemed impossible for something so large. When the forest sounds gradually returned, Diana realized she'd been holding her breath. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her radio to report the encounter. But report what exactly? She'd seen something, but in that brief glimpse through the trees, with the light fading and shadows playing tricks, could she swear to what it was? Could she write a report that wouldn't make her sound unstable or unreliable? She compromised. She reported seeing a large animal, possibly a bear, exhibiting unusual behavior. She marked the location on GPS. And that night, alone in her quarters, she called Special Agent Marcus Riley, whose number she'd been given when the GBI had briefed refugee staff about the Rebecca Hartwell investigation. "I know how this is going to sound," Diana told him, her voice tight with emotion. "But I think I saw what everyone's been talking about. And Riley, I don't think it's just a bear or a myth. I think there's something out there that we don't have a classification for." Riley listened, asked detailed questions and documented everything. Diana was the 15th credible witness who'd contacted him since Vernon's trial, all reporting similar encounters in or around the Okefenokee. 15 people with professional backgrounds in wildlife management, law enforcement or outdoor recreation, not prone to flights of fancy or misidentification. All describing essentially the same thing, a large bipedal creature moving through terrain that should have been impassable, exhibiting behaviors that suggested intelligence and intentionality. He compiled these reports into what he privately called the Okefenokee File, knowing it would never be official case material but preserving it nonetheless for whoever might need it in the future. Because Riley had come to a conclusion that he couldn't prove but felt in his bones was true. There was something in the Okefenokee, something that had been there long before white settlers arrived, probably before the Creek and Seminole peoples had named these waters. Something that had its own territory, its own patterns, its own relationship with the land that humans were only beginning to understand. Whether that something had been involved in Rebecca Hartwell's death, Whether it had witnessed Vernon's assault or intervened in some way, or claimed her body after Vernon fled, Riley couldn't definitively say. But the evidence suggested that Rebecca's final hours had been witnessed by more than just Vernon Kimball. And that possibility, that her last moments in this world might have included an encounter with something ancient and unknowable, gave Riley a strange sense of comfort, even as it troubled his rational mind. Vernon Kimball died in prison in August 2025. He was 68 years old, and the official cause of death was a heart attack, sudden and massive. He'd been in the exercise yard, had clutched his chest and collapsed, was dead before the medical staff could reach him. Some might call it justice, divine or otherwise. Riley saw it simply as the end of a man who'd carried guilt and fear for 34 years, and whose body had finally surrendered to that weight. But before Vernon died, he'd written letters. Dozens of them, most never sent, found in his cell after his death. They were addressed to Rebecca, to her mother, to the investigators, even to the judge who'd sentenced him. And in them, Vernon had expanded on his confession, adding details he'd been too afraid or ashamed to include in the official statement. Riley obtained copies through Vernon's public defender. Reading them felt like examining the fractured psychology of a man trying to reconcile what he'd done with what he'd witnessed. Vernon wrote repeatedly about that October night, about leaving Rebecca injured in the woods, and then hearing sounds that made him hide in his trailer for 3 days. He described the screaming, not human but not quite animal, that had echoed across the swamp around midnight. He wrote about going back the next morning and finding her gone, finding the drag marks and tracks that led deeper into the wilderness. But in one letter, written just weeks before his death, Vernon wrote something he'd never mentioned before. "I went back again, about a week later, when the searches had stopped. I don't know why. Maybe to see if she was still alive somehow. Maybe to bury her if I found her body. I followed the tracks as far as I could, deeper than I'd ever been in that swamp. And I found a place, a clearing where something lived. There were bones there, animal bones mostly, but I saw her locket, the gold one she was wearing. It was hanging on a branch like someone had put it there deliberate, like a marker or a memorial. I took it, and I carried it for years until I couldn't carry the weight anymore, and I threw it in the Withlacoochee River in 2003. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did, and I'm sorry I didn't tell the truth about what I saw. But I swear on my soul, something else was there. Something that maybe finished what I started, or maybe tried to help her in its own way. I'll never know. But I see it in my dreams, standing in that clearing, holding her like she weighed nothing, and sometimes in the dreams it's a monster, and sometimes it's an angel, and I can't tell the difference anymore. The locket was never recovered. Divers searched the Withlacoochee where Vernon indicated he'd thrown it, but a river keeps its secrets and yields them only when it chooses. But the description matched Rebecca's grandmother's locket perfectly, the one she'd been wearing when she disappeared, the one that had never been found with her remains. Dr. Chen, reading Vernon's letter at Riley's request, offered her professional assessment. He was trying to absolve himself of full responsibility by creating a narrative where something else was the primary agent of death. It's a common psychological defense mechanism in perpetrators who can't fully accept their culpability. The locket detail could be false memory, or he could have removed it from her body himself and convinced himself over the years that he'd found it later. "But you don't sound convinced," Riley observed. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. "I've spent my career dealing in facts, in evidence that can be measured and verified, but this case, it has elements that resist easy categorization. The bone damage, the distance the body was moved, the witness reports, even Vernon's psychological state, all of it suggests something more complex than the official narrative admits. Do I think there's an unknown primate species in the Okefenokee? The scientist in me says the evidence is insufficient, but the human being in me, who's seen things that don't fit in textbooks, I'm not as certain as I used to be." The clearing that Riley and Clayton Briggs had found, with the claw-marked trees and scattered bones, became a focal point for researchers interested in cryptozoology. A team from the North American Wildlife Research Foundation, a private organization that investigated unusual animal reports, conducted a 3-week expedition to the site in spring 2025. They set up camera traps, collected hair samples from the claw marks, documented everything with scientific rigor. The results were simultaneously fascinating and inconclusive. The hair samples contained DNA that was predominantly human, with some degraded sequences that couldn't be definitively identified. The camera traps captured thousands of images of ordinary wildlife: deer, boar, bears, alligators, but nothing unusual. One camera, positioned overlooking the clearing itself, malfunctioned on the third night, its memory card corrupted in a way the technical team couldn't explain. The final image before the corruption showed the clearing in infrared, and in that image, there appeared to be a large heat signature at the clearing's edge, but the resolution was too poor and the image too compromised to draw any conclusions. "We can't prove there's an unknown species here," the team leader, Dr. Raymond Valdez, told the press conference after the expedition concluded, "but we also can't definitively rule it out. The Okefenokee is vast, remote, and understudied. There are areas of this refuge that humans rarely if ever visit. If there were a small population of a large, intelligent, elusive animal, this would be an ideal habitat. We need more research, more funding, more serious scientific attention before we can answer the question definitively." More research, more funding. The perpetual refrain of science confronting the limits of current knowledge. But funding follows established paradigms, and paradigms resist evidence that doesn't fit their frameworks. So the Okefenokee file grew thicker with reports and data and photographs that suggested something extraordinary, while the official scientific position remained skeptical, agnostic. In Valdosta, life continued. Rebecca Hartwell became part of the community's history, a tragedy remembered but no longer defining the town's identity. The elementary school where she'd taught established a scholarship in her name, awarded annually to a graduating senior pursuing education degrees. Her grave in the church cemetery was visited regularly, not just by family anymore, most of her immediate family had passed away, but by former students who remembered her kindness, and by strangers who'd followed the case and felt connected to her story. Jennifer Caldwell, Rebecca's maid of honor, started a podcast in 2024 called Mysteries of the Okefenokee, where she interviewed witnesses, researchers, and investigators about the strange phenomena reported in and around the refuge. The Rebecca Hartwell case featured prominently, but Jennifer expanded to cover other disappearances, other encounters, building a comprehensive oral history of the unexplained in South Georgia. The podcast found an audience, people hungry for mysteries that acknowledged complexity rather than offering easy answers. Detective Marcus Webb, now 77 years old, listened to every episode. He'd been interviewed for several, sharing what he could share given confidentiality restrictions, hinting at what he couldn't. He'd become something of an elder statesman among investigators who specialized in unusual cases, his Okefenokee file circulating quietly among law enforcement and researchers who understood that official records only tell part of any story. On October 12, 2025, the 34th anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance, Webb drove out to the site where her car had been found. It was a pilgrimage he made every few years, a way of maintaining connection with a case that had defined much of his career. The old clay road was even more overgrown now, barely passable, reclaimed by the forest that had always wanted it back. He stood in the spot where the Honda had been parked, where Rebecca's shoe had been found pressed into the clay, and he thought about all the evidence and theories and testimonies that had accumulated over 3 decades. He thought about Vernon Kimball's confession and his letters. He thought about the witnesses who'd seen something in these woods, about the tracks and the bones, and the piece of wedding dress 30 feet up a tree. He thought about Rebecca herself, 26 years old and full of life, driving down this road in her wedding dress for reasons no one would ever fully understand. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the pines, Webb heard something. Distant but distinct, a sound that was almost a call, almost a cry echoing across the swamp. It raised the hair on his neck and made his breath catch, not from fear, but from recognition. He'd heard recordings of similar sounds, collected by researchers over the years, from wilderness areas across North America. Sounds that didn't match any catalogued species, that suggested something vocal and intentional and aware. Webb stood still listening as the sound faded into the evening chorus of frogs and insects. He didn't reach for his phone to record it. He didn't call anyone to report it. He simply stood as a witness, acknowledging what he'd heard, adding it to the mental file he'd been building for 34 years. When he got back to his truck, he sat for a moment before starting the engine, and he spoke aloud to the empty cab. "I hope you found peace, Rebecca. Whatever happened to you out here, whatever you encountered in those final hours, I hope it wasn't all terror and pain. I hope there was something, I don't know, something greater than us, older than us, that was there with you." It was as close to prayer as Webb, a lifelong skeptic, had come in years. And driving back to Valdosta, as night fell over the Okefenokee, he felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of resolution, not because all questions had been answered, but because he'd accepted that some questions don't have answers we can articulate. Some mysteries exist in the space between what we know and what we experience, and that space is sacred in its own way. The official story of Rebecca Lynn Hartwell's disappearance and death is straightforward. She was attacked by Vernon Dale Kimball on October 12, 1991, left injured in the Okefenokee wilderness, where she died of her injuries. Her body was scattered by natural processes and scavenging animals over 32 years until finally discovered in 2023. Genetic Genealogy identified her killer, who was prosecuted and convicted. Justice delayed but ultimately served. Case closed. The unofficial story, the one told in supplemental files and witness interviews and late-night conversations among those who've spent time in the deep swamp, is more complex. It suggests that Rebecca's final hours involved more than just Vernon Kimball and natural decomposition. It proposes that something else lives in the Okefenokee, something large and bipedal and intelligent, something that has existed in these waters and forests for longer than we've been keeping records. Whether that something was predator or witness, threat or mercy, killer or guardian remains unclear. Perhaps it's all of those things. Perhaps the categories we use, natural and supernatural, animal and human, evil and innocence, are too rigid to capture the reality of what exists in places like the Okefenokee, where wilderness persists and ancient patterns continue regardless of our attempts to understand them. Rebecca's story doesn't have a neat ending, despite the conviction and the closed case file. It has instead a kind of transformation, becoming part of the larger mystery of the swamp itself, joining the long history of disappearances and strange encounters that have been reported since people first ventured into these waters. She's remembered not just as a victim, but as someone who, perhaps, touched something beyond ordinary human experience in her final moments. Her former students, now adults with children of their own, tell their kids about Miss Hartwell, the kind teacher who disappeared on her wedding day. Some tell the official story, others add the whispered details, about something in the woods, about mysteries that persist, about the importance of respecting forces greater than ourselves. And sometimes, when those families visit the Okefenokee, when they stand at the edge of the swamp and look into the dark water and dense forests, they feel it too. That sense of presence, of being watched, of sharing space with something that was here first and will be here last. Is that just the natural human response to wilderness, the primitive part of our brain that recognizes we're not the apex predator in every environment? Or is it genuine awareness of something that defies our taxonomies and challenges our certainty about what is and isn't possible? Each person has to answer that for themselves. The evidence supports both interpretations, rational and mysterious, explained and inexplicable. The truth, as it so often does, lives somewhere in between. Rebecca Lynn Hartwell was 26 years old when she disappeared on October 12, 1991. She was a teacher, a daughter, a friend, a bride who never made it to her wedding. She deserved better than what happened to her. She deserved the life that was stolen, the future that was taken. Vernon Kimball was responsible for that theft, and he faced consequences for his actions. But there's a part of her story that transcends human justice, that exists in the realm of the unknown and unknowable. And maybe, just maybe, that's where she found something that human systems could never provide. A return to something primal and ancient, a place where the boundaries between life and death, between our world and whatever lies beyond it, are thinner than we usually admit. The Okefenokee keeps its secrets, but sometimes if you listen carefully, if you pay attention to the evidence that doesn't fit and the testimonies that can't be dismissed, those secrets whisper their truths. Not in words we can transcribe or evidence we can present in court, but in the recognition that our maps of reality are incomplete, that there are spaces on those maps marked "Here be dragons," because we genuinely don't know what's there. Rebecca Hartwell walked into one of those spaces on October 12, 1991. What she encountered there, human evil, natural predator, ancient guardian, or something that encompasses all of those categories, we may never know with certainty. But her story reminds us that mystery isn't just the absence of answers. Sometimes it's the presence of something too large, too complex, too other for our categories to contain. And in the Okefenokee, where the earth trembles beneath your feet and the water runs black and deep, where Spanish moss hangs like shrouds and the sounds at night belong to no animals you can name, that mystery persists, waiting, watching, reminding us that we share this world with more than we've discovered, and that some discoveries come at a cost we can barely comprehend. Could what happened to Rebecca be explained entirely by human evil and natural processes? Absolutely. The evidence supports that conclusion, and it's the one that brings the most closure to those who loved her. But could there be more to the story? Something that exists in the shadows between documented species and ancient legend? Something that witnesses and evidence and rational analysis can't quite dismiss? Could Rebecca's final moments have included an encounter with something that challenges everything we think we know about what's possible in these forests?